Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and not too long ago I did a review of the independent movie Born of Hope, which is about Aragorn's parents and how they met, got married, and ended up having Aragorn. And in a comment on that one, somebody asked me if I could also review The Hunt for Gollum, which is another independent film. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. Now, The Hunt for Gollum independent film is a lot shorter. It's less than 40 minutes. It's not very plot intensive, and it's based on very little source material. The source material is almost entirely contained within the Council of Elrond chapter in the Fellowship of the Ring, where Aragorn kind of describes what he does in finding Gollum and bringing him to the woodland realm. So there's not a whole lot to go on, but I'll get into that, the differences between the source material and the independent movie, and what I think about it as a whole. So as I said, the source material is pretty scant, which is probably why the movie is so short. There's just really not much to be put onto film, even to the extent that they did embellish it. They couldn't embellish too much. The source material, we get Gandalf telling Frodo part of the story in the Shadows of the Past chapter early on, where he talks about having Aragorn help him find Gollum, how Gandalf at one point kind of gave up because it seemed hopeless, and then Aragorn finally did find Gollum, and then Gandalf met him at the Woodland Realm and got what information he could out of Gollum. What we learn from Aragorn in the Council of Elrond is basically that he was searching basically all along the Anduin and in Ithilien and even the borders of Mordor, and then just kind of by chance finally came upon him, got lucky, caught him, tied him up, and had a really, really nasty time getting him back to the Woodland Realm. Basically, he gives the idea that Gollum made every inch of that journey a total pain, and risky too, because Gollum would have made it his location obvious to any enemies if he could. So that's really about all we know about the hunt for Gollum from the story. The movie adds a few things that kind of embellish that a little bit. It starts off with Aragorn meeting Gandalf in the Prancing Pony, and it's the scene that sets it up is very similar to kind of the Prancing Pony scene in both the Lord of the Rings, where we see Strider sitting in a corner by himself with his hood up, can't really see his face, smoking a pipe. In fact, we get a very much copied scene of that in this movie. And it's also kind of similar to the one in The Hobbit, where it shows Gandalf meeting Thorin in Prancing Pony, meeting him and setting up the later events of The Hobbit. So here what happens is he sets up the search for Gollum by basically Gandalf telling Aragorn, Gollum has escaped, we need to find him, and then that gets us off on our adventure. So Strider, which is really almost all he's called in this movie because this is kind of pre-Lord of the Rings, he makes his way, and mostly what we see is his activity in Ithilien, or that general area, because that's kind of the borders of Mordor where he ended up catching Gollum in the first place. There's kind of like a little montage scene that shows him traveling, getting to that location. Once he's there, there's a couple of extra additional points that add up to building the plot a little bit. He runs into somebody in Ithilien, and they make kind of a dramatic scene out of it. It's like he knows somebody's there, and he kind of sneaks around, and well, he doesn't sneak around. The other person seems to be sneaking around, and then right when they're about to come up behind him, he kind of turns at the last minute and gets the upper hand. Turns out the other guy is also a ranger from the north who says he was sent to kind of check on the movements of the enemy and whatnot. And he gives Aragorn Strider, which is all that he calls himself to this other ranger, which seems a little weird. He gives him some information about a legend that seems to be going around the locals of, people are saying that some blood-sucking monster is coming and stealing their children and doing all these nasty things. And that actually is also straight out of the book, because that is mirrored in what Gandalf tells Frodo, I think that's in the Shadow of the Past chapter. But the idea is that Gollum, after escaping, he did kind of have to do some really disturbing things to keep himself alive. So then we have, them discussing their stuff. The other ranger goes back to the north to let Aragorn continue his search. He finally does catch Gollum. He puts him in a bag, which I imagine probably they did in the movie because they didn't have the budget or the technology to get anywhere nearly as good a CG effect of Gollum as in the movies. So they put him in a bag for most of it, so he's on screen, but you can't really see him. And he is kind of making himself a total nuisance. As Aragorn is trying to return, he runs into some orc raid, which they kind of set up a little bit. He has this fight with probably a dozen or more orcs. And at the end of it, there's kind of a boss fight, kind of like in the Fellowship of the Ring, where Aragorn fights the one big orc that's about to kill Boromir. And in this particular instance, he actually gets stabbed or cut, and the weapon he gets stabbed or cut with has poison, so he ends up kind of dropping unconscious. He has uh, dreams or visions of Arwen, which is reminiscent of the Two Towers, and then he finally wakes up, ends up making his way to the Woodland Realm, drops off Gollum. Then we get a scene with Gandalf talking to Gollum, trying to find out what he can. And then after that, Gandalf and Aragorn kind of have one last conversation, which kind of deliberately sets up the meeting that Strider is going to have in Bree with the hobbits in the Fellowship of the Ring. So that's kind of the way the story goes in the movie. Now let me talk about some of my thoughts and what I think about it. So let me start with some of the more objective elements of the movie making aspects. The cinematography to me just struck me as trying too hard to be cool. The montages seem pointless. The way the camera angles change, zoom in, zoom out, it's all trying to be dramatic, but it ends up just looking cheesy. The cinematography didn't do anything for me at all. Um, Visually, the movie is kind of similar to Born of Hope in that the costumes seem kind of a mixed bag. There's nothing horrible in it, but some of it definitely seems straight out of Middle Earth from Peter Jackson's vision, and some of it seems just kind of generic medieval fantasy. So on those terms, it's kind of on the same level with Born of Hope, which for an indie film is not bad. On another visual level, the orcs are not that great. In fact, the kind of boss fight orc that Aragorn fights towards the end, he looks kind of more like Voldemort from the Harry Potter movies than an orc, and that was a little off-putting to me. It's like it's like somebody just had a costume that messed with their face a little bit, and they're like, "Hey, I can use this as an orc face." It's not really that orcish looking. It's yeah, more like Voldemort. Anyway, then you get the music. The music is not obviously Howard Shore, but it seems like it's very deliberately patterned after Howard Shore's score for The Lord of the Rings. So I mean, the music isn't bad, but it just seems like a cheap imitation, and it would be better, I think, if they had just stuck with let's make our own kind of music. Don't necessarily try to copy, just do our own thing. One other thing about the movie aspect, more objectively, the acting is not that great. You wouldn't expect A-list actors, obviously, for an indie movie, but even compared to Born of Hope, which, again, is an indie movie, that had fairly decent acting. This one, everybody kind of seems a little stilted. They're just kind of giving their lines, and it's probably partially because, and I'll get to this a little bit later, the movie is trying to very much imitate the Peter Jackson movies because you've got a lot of the same characters. You've got Aragorn, you've got Gandalf, and you can tell they're kind of trying to be like those characters are portrayed in Peter Jackson's movies. Maybe that's why the acting doesn't come off so well, but for one reason or another, to me, the acting just doesn't really do anything for me. So that's kind of my thoughts on the general cinematography and the more objective movie making elements. Now let's look at some of the plot points, some of how the just different changes they made affect what the story does. So one thing that I forgot to mention earlier in my general description of the movie, there is a Nazgul encounter, actually maybe two, I forget now, but there's a point, at least one, where Aragorn realizes there's a Nazgul nearby. He kind of sees him off in the distance. He tries to hide. There's never really anything major that happens with that, but it's kind of just a throw in, and it kind of fits in with this part of my review because the entire movie seems like it's kind of just a slavish imitation slash setup for Peter Jackson's movies. Like I mentioned before, you've got the scene in the Prancing Pony where we get Strider with his hood over his face and smoking his pipe, and we've got these scenes that are basically lifted directly out of Peter Jackson's movies and recreated for this one, and they don't serve any purpose other than fan service, and that's kind of all the Nazgul does too. Other plot points that I found weird: the Orc raid doesn't seem to have any purpose other than to give Aragorn a fight scene, and this is the hunt for Gollum. It doesn't really need to have a fight scene. The other weird thing too was his encounter with the other ranger. Several points about this struck me as just really bizarre. One of those being he doesn't use his real name with the ranger, even though Aragorn is the chieftain of the Dunedain. Everybody in the Rangers would know who he is. It's not really a secret. I mean, he's trying to keep his identity secret from the enemy, but the Rangers, the Dunedain, why would he keep it secret from them? He calls himself Strider to this other guy, and they act like they don't know each other at all. The other weird point is the other Dunedain ranger says, I was sent here. Sent by who? Again, Aragorn is supposed to be the chieftain of the Dunedain. You would think he would know this, because in the book we get the idea, especially when you read the appendices and whatnot, that Aragorn kind of knows what all the Dunedain are doing, at least in a general sense, because he's the one who kind of sets up the watch on the Shire. He sets some of the Dunedain to keep an eye on, bridges and things like that, make sure that the Shire isn't invaded. And you get other points where the Dunedain seem to be at least generally under his, command. He's giving at least general orders of what they need to be doing. Maybe not micromanaging because he can't. He's one guy and they're covering all of Eriador basically. So but you never get the idea that they leave the north until the very end, where several of them come and meet him in Helm's Deep. So, well, they don't meet him in Helm's Deep, but close enough. So it's weird that Aragorn would not know about this particular ranger being in Ithilien, since you would tend to think if anybody sent him there, it would be the chieftain of the Dunedain. It's also weird that the other guy doesn't know his name. That whole thing just strikes me as bizarre. It's like he's trying to keep his identity secret from literally everyone. And we know from the book that that's not the case. We know the other Dunedain largely know who he is. So that's just weird. And I can't really get over it either because it's so doesn't fit. But anyway, other than that, there's not a whole lot of plot differences. Mostly, like I said, it's kind of that slavish imitation because there are so many scenes, like his boss fight scene being reminiscent of the one in the Fellowship of the Ring. There's just so many scenes that are just, you can tell what they're doing is just imitating Jackson for fan service. And another one of those, of course, would be, like I said earlier, the part where he, kind of passes out from poison and, sees Arwen in a dream or vision, whatever it is, clearly presaging the two towers. It's like it makes it even worse because that whole thing is added in the movies. That doesn't happen in the books, even in the Two Towers. So now that you're doing it again, we're supposed to think that Aragorn has the same thing happen to him twice. What are the odds? That's just, not to mention, it's just weird anyway. So to me, this movie doesn't really do anything for me as a Lord of the Rings fan. It doesn't really have much of a plot. There's not much of a plot you could give it. It's not their fault. There's not much material to go on, but the hunt for Gollum in The Lord of the Rings is described in very short terms because it doesn't need a lot of description. It's one element of things that led up to the Fellowship. It's not really a story in and of itself. And so I think probably even trying to make it as a movie was a mistake for those reasons. And then if you're going to do it as a movie, then at least try to be a little original with it. Born of Hope, at least, mostly stuck to the material And when they didn't, they weren't just trying to put fan service stuff in. They did do a little bit of cliche type things with the storyline in Born of Hope, but they weren't, I'm going to copy exactly what Peter Jackson did here just so it's like, oh, look, that's a scene from the movie. So I think The Hunt for Gollum is one that you could, even if you're a die-hard Lord of the Rings fan, you could easily pass on. If you want to watch it just for curiosity, it's not going to hurt. It's not going to waste a lot of your time. Like I said, it's less than 40 minutes, but it's really not worth your time, in my opinion. So I'll just leave it there. So there is my review of The Hunt for Gollum, the independent movie. Um, I'm sorry I couldn't recommend it more highly. I really was hoping for something interesting, but it's just too. And like I said, it's partially not the movie's fault. I mean, partially it is just because there's really not much plot. I mean, you can't build a story off of this. It's meant to be a short little description in the book because that's really all it is. At least with Born of Hope, they're going off of something that Tolkien really expanded on because it is worth making a story out of. The Hunt for Gollum, no. I mean, Aragorn even says in the Council of Relron, I'm not going to tell you all the silly details of how I got Gollum back to the woodland realm. It's not worth it. Yeah, it's really not. It wasn't worth making a movie out of it either. But even with that said, I think they could have done a better job just in terms of not being so heavy on the fan service, not being so, not quite so cheap with the costuming, and not so attempting to be dramatic cinematography. So, I mean, I think they just really were trying to be a lot more than what the source material really allows for, and I think that's kind of where this one falls flat. So, that's my thoughts for what it's worth. So, I hope you enjoyed the review. Hope it gave you some indication of whether you might want to watch it or not. If you want to, you can also watch my review of Born of Hope if you haven't seen that one already. If you did enjoy the video, please do give it a like, share it around. If you want to learn more about Tolkien, Middle Earth related or not, please do subscribe to the channel, or you can follow me at JRRT Lore. And if you want specific topics covered, please do leave those in the comments. I try to keep up. And like I said, this one itself was a comment suggested topic, so I do try to address things. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.